A camera trap in the state of Para captured something in the dry season of 2023 that made the field team stop and look twice. A jaguar, a full-grown adult male, was walking the edge of a riverbank where cattle had grazed for 3 decades, not chasing the cattle, not being hunted, just walking, moving north, moving through a landscape that had been considered ecologically dead for a generation. Nobody expected him there. The model said he should not have been there. But the camera does not lie, and the paw prints in the riverbank mud confirmed it. This is happening along one of the longest ecological restoration corridors ever attempted on Earth. A strip of reforested land and protected riverbank running 2,600 kilometers through the heart of Brazil, connecting the Amazon rainforest to the Cerrado savanna, two of the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. The people building it did not start with big machines or federal mandates. They started with seeds and farmers and an idea that most scientists in the early 2000s thought was unrealistically ambitious. This is the story of how a biologist's sketch on a map in 2008 became one of the most consequential ecological projects in the world. And the results are beginning to exceed everything the models predicted. To understand why this matters, you need to know what was lost. Tens of millions of years ago, the central band of South America was a continuous, unbroken RC of life. The Amazon rainforest, the largest tropical forest on Earth, did not stop at some arbitrary line. It transitioned gradually southward into the Cerrado, the ancient savanna that covers about 2 million square kilometers of Brazil's interior. Scientists consider the Cerrado the most species-rich savanna on the planet, more biodiverse than the African savanna, more biodiverse than anything researchers had expected from a landscape that looks, from the outside, like dry scrubland. Rivers linked those worlds. The Araguaia River begins near the city of Alto Araguaia in Mato Grosso state and flows north for 2,600 kilometers before joining the Tocantins River in Para. For millions of years, this river corridor was the living bridge between two worlds. Tapirs moved along its banks. Giant river otters hunted its backwaters. Harpy eagles nested in the gallery forests that lined both shores. Maned wolves ran the grasslands of the Cerrado and moved north into the forest margins. Spider monkeys swung through the canopy above the floodplains. And jaguars, the largest cats in the Western Hemisphere, used the river as a highway, moving between the vast Amazon to the north and isolated jaguar populations in Imas National Park to the south, nearly 1,800 kilometers away. The Amazon alone holds 30% of all terrestrial biodiversity on Earth. At least 2,500 tree species grow within it, roughly 1/3 of all tropical tree species known to science. The Cerrado, though it covers less land and is far less famous, has over 1,200 species of birds, more than 90 species of bats, and over 190 species of reptiles. The Cerrado is the Brazilian biome with the second highest number of vulnerable and endangered animal species, with over 300 species at risk. And the corridor between the Amazon and the Cerrado was what allowed populations to move, to breed, to remain genetically connected across a continent. Then came the machines. Beginning in the 1960s, the Brazilian government built highways into the Amazon's interior. The Trans-Amazonian Highway opened in 1972, settlers followed the roads, cattle followed the settlers. Deforestation followed everything. Between 2001 and 2020, the Amazon lost over 54 million hectares of forest, an area roughly the size of France. In the Cerrado, the damage was even more complete. 50% of the Cerrado's natural vegetation has been cleared, most of it for soybean production and cattle ranching. 50% gone in less than 60 years. The Araguaia River corridor was hit from both sides at once. Cattle ranchers cleared the gallery forests along the riverbanks, which are legally protected but widely violated. The soil eroded into the river silted up, shade-dependent plants along the margins died, and the animals that had used the corridor for millions of years found their road blocked. The jaguar populations in the southern Cerrado became isolated inside Imas National Park, cut off, unable to move, unable to find mates from other populations, unable to sustain the genetic diversity required for long-term survival. By 2008, the Araguaia corridor did not look like a corridor anymore. It looked like a patchwork of farms, pastures, and isolated fragments of original vegetation, surrounded by a sea of soy and cattle. A field ecologist reviewing satellite imagery of the region described it as a system that had forgotten what it used to be. That was the year Leandro Silveira drew his map. Silveira is a conservation biologist who had spent years studying jaguar ecology across multiple Brazilian biomes. He worked at the Onca Pintada Institute, one of Brazil's leading wildlife research organizations, and in 2008 he founded the Jaguar Conservation Fund to formalize research he had been conducting in the Cerrado and the Araguaia region for years. Silveira had spent years tracking jaguars with camera traps and GPS satellite collars. He understood their movement patterns better than almost anyone alive. And he had reached a conclusion that most of his colleagues found wildly optimistic. The corridor was not gone. It was fragmented. In the tropics, fragmented does not mean dead. It means waiting. Silveira's key insight was that the river itself still existed. The Araguaia River was still flowing. The native seed bank in the soil was still viable. Private landowners were required by Brazil's forest code to maintain native vegetation on portions of their land, meaning fragments of intact forest still existed on thousands of farms. The pieces were still there, they just needed to be reconnected. Silveira proposed a corridor 2,600 kilometers long and up to 40 kilometers wide, running along both banks of the Araguaia and Tocantins rivers. It would cross 6 Brazilian states. It would require the planting of around 1.7 billion native trees on privately owned land. And it would need the cooperation of 24,000 separate rural property owners, most of whom had spent their lives clearing forest to make way for cattle and soybeans. When this vision was presented to the conservation community, the skeptics were vocal. The scale was too large, the landowner resistance would be insurmountable. The timeline stretched across generations. But a Dutch entrepreneur named Ben Valks had a different reaction. He saw an organisational problem, not an ecological impossibility. Valks founded the Black Jaguar Foundation in 2009 after visiting Brazil and seeing the scale of what had been lost along the Araguaia. He had no background in conservation science. He had a background in building organisations, in negotiating partnerships, in navigating resistance. He hired Brazilian forest engineers, ecologists and local community coordinators. He built tree nurseries inside the corridor zone. And he approached farmers not as adversaries, but as the people without whom the entire project was meaningless. The intervention worked on 3 simultaneous tracks. The first was seedling production. The Black Jaguar Foundation built nurseries capable of growing hundreds of thousands of native seedlings per planting season. Each nursery cultivates trees from seeds collected within the local ecosystems of the corridor, ensuring genetic diversity suited to the specific soils and hydrology of the Araguaia and Tocantins river margins. By the 2024 to 2025 planting season, nursery capacity had expanded to 650,000 seedlings per season, growing more than 75 native Amazon and Cerrado species. The approach prioritises quality over speed. Ben Valks described the philosophy directly, saying it is better to have a small area with good results than a bigger area with poor results. The second track was the Araguaia Seed Network, known as Reconnecting. This is a seed collection initiative that trains people from local communities to identify and harvest seeds from the remaining native trees on their own land, on roadsides, and along forest edges throughout the corridor zone. It gives local families an income stream that depends on the health of native trees rather than their removal. It is also the project's most important insurance policy against genetic bottlenecks. Trees grown from seeds collected within the corridor carry the specific genetic adaptations that the original ecosystem spent millions of years developing. The third track was farmer negotiation. Field coordinator Dmitrio Shivanin and his team spent years approaching individual landowners, farm by farm. The legal argument was clear. Under Brazil's forest code, landowners in the Amazon biome must maintain 80% of their property under native vegetation, with at least 30 meters of protective vegetation along riverbanks. Many landowners were already in violation, at risk of fines and legal exposure. The economic argument was more durable. Carlos Felix, owner of the 1,500-hectare Bella Vista farm along the Araguaia River, told the Foundation's team that healthy, intact forest along his river margins improved drainage of his agricultural areas during the rainy season and enriched his soils over time. He committed to keeping 51% of his farm in intact native forest. He called that percentage very unusual for the region. He was right. In each restored area, teams used a combination of methods. Hand planting of seedlings was combined with direct seeding using agricultural machinery, which allows restoration to proceed at a scale that hand planting alone cannot achieve. In areas abandoned more recently, natural regeneration was encouraged and monitored. Some plots showed remarkable recovery on their own once cattle were fenced out. Researchers measured soil composition, canopy cover, species diversity, and wildlife activity through camera traps distributed across dozens of points in the restored zones. In the early seasons, the results were quiet. Saplings were waist high. A camera trap might photograph a capybara or an armadillo, but little more. The ecological action was happening underground, in the roots and the seed bank and the soil fungi, building a foundation that would not be visible for years. Then the data started arriving in ways nobody expected. Scientists expected modest early returns, gradual canopy closure, maybe some bird diversity and restored plots after 8 to 10 years. What they found was something different. By the 2024 to 2025 planting season, the Black Jaguar Foundation had passed 1.2 million native trees in active growth across the corridor, with 626 hectares under active restoration. The survival rate of planted trees was running at 90%, a figure that exceeded the projections from earlier tropical restoration modelling. In the tropics, trees do not grow the way they grow in temperate forests. A seedling that starts at knee height in November can reach 3 meters by the following dry season. By year 3, some species close the canopy. By year 5, the restored plots were recording species that the teams had not projected for another decade. Primates appeared in areas restored just 5 years earlier. In neighbouring Rondonia state, ecologist Paulo Henrique Bonavigo of the environmental organisation Ecopor documented Jaguarundis, a small Amazonian wildcat, in areas that had been open cattle pasture just 10 years before and now had trees reaching 10 metres in height. Bonavigo described the finding as a very interesting result, noting that these animals are using the restored environments both to live and to move through the landscape. Areas that had been silent for a generation were becoming audible again. The jaguar provided the most dramatic evidence of corridor function. Camera traps began recording jaguar crossings in areas where the species had not been documented for decades. At a parallel restoration corridor project in southwestern Brazil, supported by Conservation International, a camera trap captured a lone jaguar moving through the restored Cerrado. Mark Wishney, the Chief Sustainability Officer at BTG Pactual Timberland Investment Group, called spotting jaguars and other big predators in the area a powerful indicator that the ecosystem is on the mend. Let me put that in context. A jaguar does not appear in a dead landscape. A jaguar requires a living prey base, which requires healthy vegetation, which requires stable soil and water, which requires intact forest on the riverbanks. When a jaguar appears, where no jaguar has been recorded for 20 years, it is not a single data point. It is a report on the entire food web. What the cascade looks like in the Araguaia zone is this. Trees planted on riverbanks stabilise the soil. Stabilised soil stops sediment loading in the river. A cleaner river supports fish populations. Fish populations support otters, herons, and the larger mammals that hunt along the banks. Those mammals distribute seeds, suppress certain plant species, and create the ecological pressure that shapes vegetation structure. And vegetation structure determines what birds nest there, which in turn determines which insects are present, it determines the pollination patterns of the trees that were planted in the first place. Nobody connects all of this to a single seedling pushed into river margin soil. But the data is unambiguous. The system was rebuilding itself, not the way engineers rebuild things, but the way nature rebuilds things. Slowly, then suddenly. The 2019 Green Capital study, commissioned to assess the full value of completing the Araguaia biodiversity corridor, found that the 1 million hectares of restored forest would collectively capture 262 million tonnes of carbon. That is approximately 8% of Brazil's entire commitment under the Paris Climate Accords, achieved through a single corridor project running along 2 rivers in the Brazilian interior. The same study estimated that restoration would save $17.1 billion in costs to the global economy, create 38,000 jobs in the corridor zone, and generate $2.7 billion in revenue for local farmers through sustainable harvesting of native forest products. 1 hectare of restored native forest on the Araguaia generates more long-term value to the surrounding agricultural economy than 1 hectare of degraded pasture, even before the carbon credits are counted. This is not romantic nature worship, this is hard-nosed economics. And yet the story is not finished, and it cannot be told honestly without this part. 1.2 million trees sounds significant until you account for the 1.7 billion trees required to complete the corridor. 626 hectares restored sounds like progress until you remember that the total corridor zone covers 10.4 million hectares, the total area at stake. The project is in its early years, and the gap between early results and ultimate ambition is measured not in seasons, but in generations of sustained work. The landowner resistance problem has not been solved. It has been managed one farm at a time, with uneven results. Volks and his team have described the challenges with unusual candour. Some farmers, after agreeing to participate, released cattle into freshly planted areas. Others sold their properties without disclosing the restoration agreements to new owners, requiring teams to restart negotiations from scratch. The Black Jaguar Foundation is asking 24,000 separate landowners to voluntarily constrain how they use their own land, in exchange for benefits that will materialise over decades. And then there is the broader economic pressure that drove the deforestation in the first place. The Mata Piba region, spanning Maranhão, Tocantins, Piauí and Bahia, sits directly adjacent to the corridor zone. It is Brazil's newest agricultural frontier, being converted to soybean production at a pace that existing conservation policy has not yet managed to slow. Cristiano Soares, who manages 5 large farms in Para and is a committed partner of the Black Jaguar Foundation, articulates the case for coexistence clearly. He has committed his operations to zero deforestation and reports measurable improvements in soil and water quality on his properties since restoration work began. But Soares is not representative of the broader agricultural sector in this region. He is, by his own description, an exception. The farmers clearing land along the corridor margins are not villains in a simple story. They are people responding to market signals, to legal frameworks that, in the Cerrado, are far more permissive about deforestation than those governing the Amazon, and to an agricultural economy that has spent 60 years treating native forest as an obstacle to productivity. No amount of scientific evidence about flying rivers and jaguar corridors will automatically override the economic calculation of a farmer facing debt and a dry season. Return to that camera trap image in Para. A jaguar walking north. He does not know about the Green Capital study, or the Paris Climate Accords, or the 24,000 landowner agreements that remain unsigned. He only knows that the riverbank is shaded now, that there is cover, that the gallery forest, which his ancestors used for millions of years, is slowly returning, that the road is open again, even if only partially, that the land, which had forgotten what it was, is beginning to remember. The researchers who reviewed that footage understood what it meant in ways the jaguar could not. They understood that an apex predator does not appear in a dead ecosystem. It appears when the ecosystem is alive enough to support everything it needs to eat, and everything beneath that in the chain. They understood that when a jaguar recolonizes a corridor, it is not just a jaguar returning. It is a predator that shapes prey populations, which shapes vegetation structure, which shapes water retention, which shapes the rainfall patterns of the farms on either side of the river. What the Araguaia Biodiversity Corridor reveals is not that nature is resilient in some vague, inspirational sense. It reveals something more specific and more demanding. It reveals that the damage done in 60 years can begin to be undone in 5, if the right trees are planted in the right places, and the right people are given genuine reasons to protect them. The system was broken quickly. It is rebuilding more slowly, but it is rebuilding. The question is not whether nature can recover. The question is whether we will give it enough time and enough space and enough human patience and economic creativity that restoration actually requires. What surprised you most about this project? Was it the speed at which animals returned to the restored zones, the scale of the economic case for restoration, or the fact that the most ambitious ecological corridor on Earth is being built one farm at a time on private land by people who once made their living clearing it? Leave it in the comments below. I read every one. If you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. We cover stories about restoration and the people who are fixing what is broken. Hit subscribe. See you in the next one.